Have you ever considered that the government might not be financially constrained like you or me? This might seem counterintuitive, given what we've been taught about economics. The mainstream view often likens governments to households, suggesting they need to collect taxes or borrow before they can spend. But let's shift the lens and view things from a modern monetary theory, or MMT, perspective. MMT challenges this household analogy. It posits that governments, the ones that issue their own currency, can never truly run out of money. They can print or create as much currency as they need. It's not a question of financial viability. Instead, the real constraints governments face are things like unused resources or capacity. If there are idle resources, such as unemployed labour, the government can spend without causing inflation. So the government budget isn't constrained by money, but by real resources and capacity. What if I told you that a country with high public debt can maintain low interest rates and inflation? Let's consider Japan. This nation has a public debt that's among the highest globally, yet it consistently manages low interest rates and inflation. How? Well, Japan's central bank has been creating money and buying bonds, a practice that mainstream economics would predict to lead to hyperinflation. But contrary to these predictions, hyperinflation hasn't materialized. Why not? It's because private sector demand for bonds consistently outstrips supply, allowing the government's financing needs to be met. This isn't just theoretical, it's happening right now, in the real world. The Japanese experience provides a compelling example that the modern monetary theory, or MMT, is not just a theory. It's a practical, workable model. Japan's example challenges the notion that deficits necessarily lead to higher rates and inflation. What if government bonds and deficits aren't what we've been led to believe? Let's delve into modern monetary theory's alternative perspective. From the MMT vantage point, government bonds are seen less as a financing mechanism and more as a monetary operation. They're not about reducing non-government spending or managing inflation risk, but rather about changing the composition of assets. Now let's talk deficits. Mainstream economics often paints deficits as inherently inflationary, but MMT begs to differ. If deficits are scaled according to the private sector's savings desires, then they aren't necessarily inflationary. In fact, they can be healthy for the economy, providing needed liquidity and supporting economic growth. So, contrary to conventional wisdom, MMT argues that deficits and bond issuance don't reduce net worth or aggregate demand. Through the MMT lens, bonds and deficits take on a different meaning. What if the current inflation is not due to excess demand, but supply constraints? This might seem like a twist in the plot, but bear with me. Picture this: the COVID pandemic hits, creating a disruption unlike anything we've seen. Services plummet while goods supplies tighten, all while income support remains in place. The result? An imbalance, a temporary one but potent enough to cause inflation. But here's the kicker. This inflation is not a result of excess demand, but from supply constraints. Now, fast forward to present day, factories are roaring back to life and services are opening up. And as they do, inflation begins to ease, showing that it's not as sensitive to interest rates as we might have thought. So what's the takeaway? In this context, supply factors, not monetary policy, are primary inflation drivers. Could mainstream policy responses to inflation be misguided? Let's consider this. Mainstream economics often resorts to rate hikes as a tool to curb inflation. However, these hikes may simply redistribute wealth from borrowers to bondholders rather than effectively tackling the root cause of inflation. Moreover, a counterintuitive aspect is that higher rates can themselves fuel inflation. How so? Well, by increasing business costs, which are then passed on to consumers. It's like pouring fuel on a fire you're trying to extinguish. Now, some might argue that the fear of the 1970s wage push inflation justifies tightening. But here's the thing. The current economic scenario is vastly different from the 1970s. Thus, using the same old playbook might not be the best strategy. In contrast to mainstream economics, MMT suggests a different approach to managing inflation. It asserts that supply factors, not monetary policy, are the primary drivers of inflation. Interesting, isn't it? Understanding MMT is more than just a mental exercise. It's a lens through which we can re-evaluate orthodox views on government finances, deficits, bonds and inflation drivers. MMT challenges the notion that governments are financially constrained like households and illustrates how deficits and bonds function differently than mainstream economics suggests. It also provides insight into the forces driving current inflation. As we've seen, the real-world validity of MMT merits serious consideration, especially by policymakers.